Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the very first MDRN event of the new academic year, which will be a lecture given by Professor Przemysław Czapliński. Today's event is organized with support of the Forum on Central and Eastern Europe, represented here by its coordinator, Dr. Albena Szkodrwa de Smet, and by the Polish Institute in Brussels, represented here by its director, Katarzyna Krause, and its senior expert, Maria Winiarska. Professor Czapliński is currently a research fellow at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. We're very happy that they were willing to borrow him for one day to give a lecture in Leuven. I don't exaggerate, I believe, if I call our guest one of the most prolific and versatile literary scholars in contemporary Poland. His output is massive, both in quantitative and qualitative terms. So far, unfortunately, most of his books have appeared only in Polish, but this is about to change. This is the brand new French edition of a book called in Polish Poruszona Mapa, but in French it's called La Carte déplacée, l'imaginaire géographique et culturel des lettres polonaises au tournant des 20e et 21e siècle. I will pass this around. A very interesting, groundbreaking book on the intersection between literary studies and cultural geography. He's much more a generalist than a modernist, I would say, and he's mostly interested in, let's say, the role of literature within social communication. In today's lecture, he will concentrate on what could be called Polish late modernism, with a particular focus on the 1970s as a time of socio-political upheaval and various transformations in the literary field. So, Professor Czapliński, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for your invitation, for which I'm deeply grateful. Happy to see you, and without any unnecessary delay, I will pass to the lecture. As you see, the title is, as it is, Democracy, Law, and the Modernist Crisis of the Masses. I will focus on the Polish culture of the 1970s. So we start at the heart of the crisis. In 1976, Poland began to washed by three waves of crisis: economic, political, and cultural. The economic crisis manifested itself in the form of shortages of goods and rising inflation. Prices didn't represent the costs of production, and production didn't correspond to real needs. In order to withdraw excess cash from the market and make prices more realistic, the parliament announced increases covering basic food stuff. It was announced in the beginning of the 1976. Well, you can imagine the impact of this level of increases. 60%, more than 60% of meat, poultry, butter and cheese, 100% increase of sugar. So it was a disaster, a catastrophe, a real catastrophe for the average family in Poland. The announcement triggered a wave of protests in Radom, especially or mainly in Radom, Ursus, Stalowa Wola, which were the industrial cities, medium-sized cities, but with huge working class. So the announcement triggered a wave of protests, and the protests were met with severe repressions. These repressions, in turn, led to the formation of the Komitet Obrony Robotników, Workers' Defense Committee, an organization providing practical, primarily legal assistance to the accused, which were a large number. At the same time, the increases announced by the government pushed people to buy up all kinds of goods, en masse, which caused a supply crisis. In June 1976, sugar ration cards were introduced. It could be a matter of different lecture how dense and intense and complex is this small card. Because the size of this card was maybe a half of my phone, yes? So different parts of this card were especially interesting for different groups of people. For instance, this one, a chocolate, yes, this small piece was the most precious part of the card for children. It is very interesting that even 2-year or 3-year-old children learned to count in no time at all, because it was one bar of chocolate for 1 month. And the normal, typical bar of chocolate in Poland in these years was consisted of 32 small pieces, 8 and 4. 8 times 4 is 32. So each child in Poland quickly learned how to count, because half of months in year has 31 days. So it was one small piece, a really small piece of chocolate for 1 day. Of course, February was the most beloved month of a year for children, because there were few, 3 or 4 surplus of pieces of chocolate. These 2 pieces were especially important for smokers. Yes, 6 and 6, so 12 pockets of cigarettes for a month. Well, if you smoke, no, you don't smoke. Well, doesn't matter, nobody's perfect. But if you have any person around you, any relative, heavily smoker, so addicted, really addicted, he or she will tell you what does it mean to have 12 pockets of cigarettes per month. Yes, it's shortage. Yeah, it's shortage of. Yeah. Okay, so a few years later, after 1976, rationing, in addition to sugar, included meat, chocolate, alcohol, cigarettes, vodka, shoes, and so on and so on. Okay, the second crisis concerned political representation. In 1976, at the request of the majority parliamentary club, 3 new provisions were introduced into the constitution on Poland's perpetual friendship with the USSR, on the leadership role of the Polish United Workers' Party, which was not at all Workers' Party, which is a matter of course, and on linking civil rights to the fulfillment of duties. These provisions, adjustments, made it blatantly obvious that Poland was a non-sovereign state and that party pluralism and civil rights were a fiction there. Neither social groups, ideologies, nor views could count on legitimate representation in this state. In response, organizations, associations, and extra-parliamentary political parties began to emerge, foreshadowing the political diversity of the 1990s. The third crisis was associated with the appropriation of the communications sphere by the ruling political party. Public media, publishing houses, cultural institutions were subject to censorship, which eliminated undesirable content or distorted facts. The breaking of the monopoly of the authorities on the means of communication took place right after the June events in 1976. With the birth of the Workers' Defense Committee, the first independent news magazines appeared. It was called Communications of the KOR, Komitet Obrony Robotników, and a moment later they were joined by the first literary magazines, so-called Zapis and Puls, and magazines with a political profile, for instance, On the Threshold. It was the first political monthly review. The triple crisis, economic, political, and cultural, of the mid-70s led to the birth of 3 independent circuits: cultural, underground publishing movement; economic, commodity trading; and political, extra-parliamentary parties and organizations. These representations were weird The cultural and political ones were narrow, and the economic activity was pathological, but the vehemence of its birth foreshadowed a different order. The complex crisis of the 1975-76 period stemmed from the fact that the state stopped fulfilling the post-war social contract. Failure to live up to the agreement has occurred in key areas. The state, remaining the largest employer and the largest producer, failed to provide decent wages or meet basic material needs. The government, instead of defending the principle of social justice enshrined in the Constitution, used its organs, militia, military forces, courts, to suppress social corrective actions. The widening distance between the reality experienced and its image conveyed by the government media meant that the image of collective identity upheld by official culture, the image of Poles as a nation accepting socialism and the post-Yalta division of Europe, was losing its unifying power. Trust in the state and the regime, official social ties, collective identity, and the propaganda portrayal of post-war reality begin to erode at an accelerated pace. Sociological analysis from the 1970s proved that Poles felt a bond with their family, with their own circle of friends, and with the nation, while they distrusted local authorities, the government, and the basic institution of the state, parliament, courts. The implication was that a social vacuum stretched between the basic level, family and friends, and the level of symbolic imagined community. Poles perceived society as a creation cobbed together from horizontal, family, social, coterie, professional circles in which individuals realize their needs, while they lost sight of society itself as a coherent structure. In the second half of the 70s, saw the appearance of books whose authors portrayed Polish reality in a state of deep crisis. Here is the list. Marek Nowakowski, Jerzy Andrzejewski, Kazimierz Brandys, Tadeusz Konwicki, for the second time, Kazimierz Orłoś, Madej, Jan Komolka. Almost all of them were stopped by the censors. Officials tried to force the writers to make deletions and changes. However, the writers no longer had to give in under censorship pressure or wait indefinitely for a decision. They directed works to the independent circulation, but didn't use underground communication for a simple anti-socialist stance. The great value of the first novels published in the underground lay precisely in the fact that their criticism was multi-directional. They were realistic and at the same time grotesque novels. They were oriented towards the description of everyday life while being suspicious of its signs, predatory towards political power but not applying a tariff to the society. Thanks to their dual opposition to the authorities and to the masses, to the society, they maintained their independence. From this position, the writers embarked on an experiment that involved arranging situations to test social bonding abilities. It seems no coincidence that in most of the works, the action takes place during a wedding, including holiday gatherings, or in a store queue. These time spaces differ significantly. A wedding is a time of abundance of reconciliation. A queue in a store is a situation of meeting random people who are unfriendly to each other. A wedding belongs in every society, and in Poland in particular, to situations deeply rooted in tradition. A queue was a product of the socialist economy of scarcity. Participation in wedding is a joyful and voluntary occasion. Standing in line at the end of the 1970s, a statistical poll spent about 1 hour per day queuing. So standing in line was forced, humiliating, and received with growing frustration. Despite their extreme dissimilarity, the two time spaces allowed us to test what social communication skills look like in practice. The ability to establish contact with the other, update traditions, and improvise new communal forms. The first of this time space, the wedding, is an archetypal motif in Polish culture. It has been used to depict the reconciliation in feuding families. For instance, Adam Mickiewicz, Pan Tadeusz is about reconciliation of two families, Soplicowie i Choreszkowie. Adam Mickiewicz, Pan Tadeusz, one of the most important poem in Polish literature, not only in last centuries, but all over the times. Alexander Fredros, The Revenge. It was written and published in 1834. It is the drama about the reuniting of conflicted social classes, like Stanisław Wyspiański's The Wedding, published in 1901, which was adapted by Andrzej Wajda in 1972. Or the renewal of ties between members of one class, one social class, like in Władysław Reymond's novel entitled The Peasants, written in 1902-1908. The enduring advantage of the motif is that it allows artists to conduct a social exam. People gathered in one place are subjected to a test of whether they can communicate and unite despite the differences that divide them, class, property, customs, or ideological. For this reason, the bride and the groom represent not only themselves, but also the social groups and historical traditions from which she and he come. And the wedding is not just a party. It is a vital test of the ability of the young to create bonds other than inherited ones. The poetics of the wedding as a collective celebration of a new bond was subjected to dismantling by the art of the 1970s. In various works, completely independent of each other, the motif appeared in a grotesque version. In Andrzejewski's novel Miazga, in Marian Pilot's short story Karzeł Mniejszy, Król Tutejszy, Smaller Dwarf, Familiar King, I don't know how to translate the title, and in very famous and very important movie made by Krzysztof Zanussi in 1980, entitled A Contract. Weddings are held even though the marriage was not concluded. So there was no official marriage, but the wedding ceremony celebration is on play. And since the marriage didn't take place, the disparate, distant, or even conflicted social groups will not come together and a new bond will not be formed. The wedding party, which is attended by guests despite the absence of the bride and groom, turns into a ghostly ball, a spectral orgy, or a social gathering free of any obligations. However, even where a marriage occurs, it doesn't have the desired effect. In the short story by Marek Nowakowski, Wesele raz jeszcze, a wedding once again, a wedding once more, the marriage and the wedding turned out to be the result of calculating. The bridegroom is an aging thief from the capital, from Warsaw, who decides to retire and chooses to marry the daughter of a rich farmer. For the wedding, he invites the village elite, it is, people capable of arranging missing goods or providing patronage. The commander of the local militia station, the president of the agricultural equipment rental company, the manager of the village grocery store, and a construction technician. Such guests will help with shady businesses or rescue them from oppression in case of conflict with the law. They all adhere to the principle, sorry for the expression, of not getting screwed. That's the principal idea, which means that they despise law and custom and regard the honest people as weak fools. It is this marriage of urban cunning with rural greed that the writer Marek Nowakowski considered the basis of the new Polish mentality, mass mentality. In the persons of his guests, he showed a society in which acceptance of immorality was becoming the attitude of the majority. Among this majority, that is at the center of the society, moral consciousness was blurring and freedom thinking was disappearing. Only the writer, invited by the groom, is aware that demoralization of the public supports the regime. His words, everyone rotten, all scorned, we are all scorned, indicate that the slaves support slavery and name the public's peculiar complicity in the moral decomposition of collective life. The importance of weddings is matched by the tradition of celebratory gatherings, especially those associated with the Catholic calendar. Konwicki chose as the time of action of his novel, The Polish Complex, the day of Christmas Eve, one of the most important holidays for the annual renewal of ties between relatives. However, the writer decided to subject this solemn day to a cynical test by placing the characters in a store queue. The people he depicts are standing at the jeweler's waiting for a shipment of gold rings because money is losing its value, so it needs to be exchanged for more solid currency. A conventional representation of post-war society appears in this queue. The biographies of the characters, strongly divergent, merge into one undifferentiated mess for which historical conflicts between the communists and their victims slowly lose their meaning. The absurdity of the situation is complemented by a world that loses its form. Despite winter, it's 24th of December, a watering can drives down the street, as it does in summer, and the weather alternately resembles spring and autumn. Despite a power outage, no lights burn on the entire street, some electrical appliances work. Everyone around recognizes the main hero, the protagonist, that is Tadeusz Konwicki, as Tadeusz Konwicki, but they, the other protagonists, the other heroes, themselves bear variable names, so no names at all. Earlier, Andrzejewski wrote about social miasma, pulp. Nowakowski about the state of rootness, while Konwicki portrayed a world subjected to decay, a world that loses its contours, becomes blurred and provides no support. However, the writer suggested that the cause of this decay is not in the cosmos, but on Earth, in Poland. It is the Polish society of the 1970s that makes, as Hamlet would say, that the world is out of joint, out of shape. For no one has any intention taking responsibility for collective life anymore, and no one wants to ask questions about the sovereignty of the state or the independence of individual choices. Thus, Konwicki transferred the situation of the wedding party to a store queue, leaving unchanged the task itself, to test the ability to communicate. The test for the characters is to overcome not so much strangeness, an ordinary thing in public space, as suspicion. Suspicion undermines, makes it difficult or even impossible to establish an ordinary relationship with a stranger. Suspicion is an anti-relationship peculiar to any society subjected to the oppression of the secret police. The suspicion that every person one encounters may be a secret agent seeps into the consciousness of such a society on a daily basis. Konwicki's procedure was to confront the reader with reality in a state of decay and to diagnose the complicity of the ordinary citizen in sustaining the regime. Silence, passivity, unwillingness to get involved in any public affairs, focus on everyday life, concern for material possessions, this is the social horizon. Eliminating the illusions that perpetuate slavery and exposing the covered-up rules of government didn't mean that Konwicki called for rebellion in his novel. On the contrary, the writer inserted into the novel two extensive parabolic pieces depicting the tragic fate of the 19th century insurgents who choose to fight, and with it humiliation and death. The Polish complex still offered small hope. In the next novel by Konwicki, A Little Apocalypse, A Small Apocalypse, the writer gave the warning a more dramatic dimension. The novel became a bestseller of the underground circulation. It had 8 editions in the period 1979-1988, and the novel shaped the social vision of Poland of the late 1970s. The plot is based on a strange visit. One day, Tadeusz K., which of course represents Tadeusz Konwicki, a writer suffering from a creative crisis, is visited by 2 of his acquaintances from opposition circles and friends who propose that as a national protest against slavery, he, I quote, burn himself under the building of the Central Party Committee. The burnt sacrifice will not be a redemptive sacrifice and will not redeem society's guilt, because society, to an even greater extent than in the Polish complex, feels innocent. But perhaps it is the great issue's death that will reveal the universal guilt, or, quotation, sin of indifference, will shake dormant consciences and provoke repentance. In A Little Apocalypse, in A Small Apocalypse, Konwicki spared no one. With satirical fury, he showed the ugliness of enslaved society, the usurpation of the national priests of art, the demoralization of power, the restlessness of the opposition. For this very reason, according to a rumor from 1979, the typesetters of the underground independent publishing house refused to assemble the book. Thanks to the grotesque aimed at so many, the writer managed to remain independent of the conciliatory, albeit anti-communist majority. Remaining, quotation, alone outside the arrangements, he captured a dangerous moment in the history of society when the most important languages of Polish patriotic tradition, especially Wallenrodism, were undergoing deep corrosion. The diagnosis that emerged from all those novels were almost catastrophic. The writers depicted a society that had undergone a great political and class transformation, yet had not developed modern cultural forms expressing the changed state. The metaphors used by the writers to name the degree of social disorganization prove significant. Andrzejewski, miasma or pulp, that is a formless mass of people. Unreality, Kazimierz Brandys, that is an unreal, imaginary, fictional world, and one that imposes its rules on everyone. Decay, Konwicki, that is a state of underdefinition, unformedness of a society. And finally, rudeness, Nowakowski, that is voluntary moral degradation chosen in exchange for opportunities for dishonest and selfish career. According to the writers, an important role in the process of decay was played by the escape of the intelligentsia from its duties, especially desertion from the function of the class creating, it's a quotation, creating the self-knowledge of society. The disappearance of self-knowledge weakens social ties with the past and softens key traditions. The authors deliberately invoked expressive motifs of Polish culture, the wedding, Christmas Eve, the independence struggle, to show that they had become empty forms, susceptible to arbitrary fulfillment. Similar images emerge from other novels of the time. Kazimierz Orłoś wrote about the social self-poisoning with lies. Bogdan Madej about the slow rolling of Polish life into petty combinationism. Jan Komolka about the social tendency to repress any form of otherness. The diagnosis of the unformedness of social reality were matched by the particular form of the novels themselves. Andrzejewski made a very important comment, I quote, "In spite of some of my inclinations to the order of closed compositions, I still have to sit and remember that the reality of my novel is open on all sides and miasmatic on the inside, so, in a sense, inefficient and unfinished." This comment fits all the text discussed. The authors freely exercised their rights to digress, to interrupt the flow of the plot with short stories, to undertake autothematic considerations, to use past and present tense alternately, to spin the story in the conditional mode, to embed the author's fictionalized version in the presented world. The novels came apart at the seams as if under the strain of the author's efforts to present an unformed reality. In all the texts discussed, there is a multiple warning. The first was about the demoralizing impact of state non-sovereignty on society as a whole. Andrzejewski put it pathetically in his novel. I quote, "The lack of a sense of sovereignty degrades both the individual and society, because only in a consciously sovereign condition can conscious human responsibility exist and act. With its disintegration and disappearance, all moral order disintegrates and disappears." Out of this moral pulp is great art to arise. End of quotation. He had to floor it. Yeah. The second warning was related to the loss of critical consciousness, which leads, Brandys argued, to a collective plunge into unreality. Quotation, "I was already sure that in my country most people were living with a deleted sense of freedom, and I was beginning to understand. It is bad when laws are broken, but it's really bad when people have forgotten their own rights." At the end of quotation. And finally, the third warning linked the widespread moral collapse to the pulpiness of society. The mixing of classes and groups here was both cause and effect of the blurring of the line between appropriate and inappropriate things, between moral and immoral, patriotic and treasonous. In turn, the reconstruction of the world, the recovery of contours, the reactivation of traditions can, according to the writers, take place through the moral act of the individual. Its freedom plays a key role as the individual performs the function of the collective conscience, reminds society of ethical criteria, testifies to the vitality of tradition. Undoubtedly, there was a lot of right in the pessimistic or catastrophic diagnosis made by the writers. Society used the non-sovereignty of the state to justify its own amoralism, blurred the key categories of collective life: good, evil, freedom, slavery, patriotism, collaboration. Society gave away civil rights in exchange for the opportunity to earn money on the side. However, it is hard not to notice that this criticism was conducted from an intelligentsia and male perspective. It was from this perspective that the people were reproached for forgetting independence. The praise of individual action contrasted with the feminine passivity of the general population, the superior abhorrence of a collectivity in which class divisions were blurred and in which people's virtues were lost. Rhetorically elevated lament over the disappearance of obliging patterns of behavior, that is, authority, vital traditions, moral norms, was an attempt to maintain the superior position of intelligentsia in the creation of an order of values. Therefore, at the center of the plots, the authors placed a lone intellectual who takes responsibility for the moral state of Poland. Paradoxically, in one thing, the writers were right. Although they were hysterical about the process of social degeneration, they accurately captured the moment of the disappearance of previous class divisions and the state of underformation of the new collectivity. Confirmation of this process was provided by the cultural representations of the social groups that found themselves on the fringes in the novels. The social disintegration was fostered, for better or worse, by the socio-cultural process taking place in Poland in the 70s. These included the deteriorating cultural representation of the working class and the end of traditional peasant culture. The working class in the 70s was entering a loop of underdevelopment. Young people from working class backgrounds were most often graduating with low qualifications, which didn't allow them to go beyond uncomplicated jobs and limited wages, which in turn led to growing social disregard. Corresponding to this and reinforcing this phenomenon was the progressive depreciation of the worker in the culture of that decade. Even a selective analysis of Polish works, films, novels, paintings of the time proves that something bad began to happen to the social image of labor and the worker in the most sensitive area, manual labor. Although dirt and materiality accompany human hands almost everywhere, the portrayal of people confined in their work to the physical sphere was acquiring a negative character at an accelerated pace. Cultural representations were becoming more and more rare, and those few presented a satirical, almost contemptuous image of workers. This can be seen in Jerzy Duda-Gracz's memorable painting The Beautiful or the Handsome Installer, which depicts an obese young man in an unbuttoned shirt and long hair, sitting in a dreamy, narcissistic pose on some kind of crate, next to which, well, I'm sorry. Yes, okay, that's him, the handsome installer. This is, it was It was an iconic image, an iconic painting, well known, far abroad, outside the circle of people interested in art. It was a painting represented and repeated in several papers, monthly review, very well known and broadly read weekly issues. Well, so we can see that he's sitting in a dreamy or narcissistic pose on some kind of crate, next to which are barrels and lying pipes. The figure looks neither defiantly nor critically in our direction, and the environment in which he finds himself, a basement mess, testifies not to work, but to a kind of superiority over those who might need his work. The protagonist of the painting fell under the disparaging term master bungler. I don't know the exact word in English, maestrunio, that is a lousy professional, yes? Used in the Polish colloquial language in the 70s to call an incompetent craftsman who botches every job, but due to the shortage of professionals has an excess of orders. So everybody wants him, but he meets our needs in a very lousy way. Below this kind of professional, there was a prole, a doer, a bungler. Well, I don't know, I'm not sure the proper word. So, robol, yes, which is a vulgar version of the word robotnik, yes? So he was below maestrunio, below this lousy professional. The robol, the doer, the prole, a prole, was exposed to the ridicule of the whole of Poland in the program From the Rear of the Store, of the Tay Cabaret, one of the most famous cabaret show of the early 80s. Dull worker, doer, prole, that is a worker with no qualifications, who himself is responsible for these deficiencies in education. Out of laziness or out of lack of intelligence, he didn't acquire a profession, so he takes the simplest jobs, requiring only physical strength. If he is poor, he is rightly so, because for the work he does, he is entitled to the lowest wages. Even Andrzej Wajda's film Man of Marble, Człowiek z marmuru, one of the most important films of post-war Polish cinema, although it showed the protagonist's life path leading from a full-blown faith in Stalinism to a tragic defiance of authority, portrayed the work of ordinary workers as a toil that devastates people and that is used by the political party to strengthen power rather than for social benefit. In the series of negative representations, an ambivalent exception was Janusz Głowacki's novel Moc truchleje. This is a fragment of Polish carol, Bóg się rodzi, moc truchleje. So God is born, the power shakes, the power trembled. Yeah, the power trembled, yes. So its main character is a primitive shipyard worker occupying the lowest place in the workers' hierarchy, blindly believing in the party, calling the world and expressing his life in the language of propaganda. Despite the sum of his handicaps, the protagonist gradually becomes independent of the party. He refuses to accept the function of an informer and independently comes to the conclusion that it is necessary to oppose the authorities in solidarity, which is of course a kind of miracle, yes? Yeah, God is born, yeah? Because there is no logic link between his state of mind, his mentality, and this solution, yeah, the solidarity. The few works that ennobled the worker didn't impede the overall process of depreciation of manual labor, the image degradation of the working class, and the sterility of workers' culture. A new class division was thus outlined at the zenith of the socialist state. It resulted from the fact that the value of labor, understood as the processing of matter, was declining, while labor, understood as the mediation of human relations with matter, was valued ever higher. As a result, the status of the working class changed in the 1970s. The importance of the manual worker was declining, while social recognition of the constructors of collective effort, engineers, managers, planners, directors, was growing. The meritocratic pretensions of this decade elevated the technical intelligentsia to the higher ranks of the social ladder and pushed unqualified people to the bottom of it. The images superimposed on them, dirt, ugliness, physical deterioration, work clothes worn even outside of work, low intelligence, vulgar language, simpering manners, caught them in a loop. Aesthetics, that is the ugliness of the image, began to take away their ethical qualities, and ethical degradation, the doer, the prole, translated into increasing aesthetic disregard. Even the images of figures on coins and banknotes informed that the working people had to give way to kings, explorers, and heroes. And here you are, the banknotes in the early days and early years of People's Republic of Poland featured a peasant woman and a woman with an oar and an anchor. In the end, almost half of the people depicted on the banknotes were women. The third series of new post-war people's banknotes depicted simple and anonymous images of working people. The banknotes were decorated with miners, peasants, workers, and shipyard workers, including, of course, women. The first harbinger of the change became issued in 1965. It was a 1,000 zloty banknote with the image of the eminent astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus. This was the first paper money after the war on which it was possible to see not a symbolic image, but a person known for his achievements by name. A marked change, however, occurred in 1975. No longer anonymous workers, but heroes of the labor movement were to adorn Polish money. Yes? So General Karol Świerczewski, Tadeusz Kościuszko, well, so you see, famous people. In the second half of the 70s, the depreciation of the working class was matched by the rise in prestige of the socialist middle class. The work in which these two processes overlapped was the record-breaking popular series Being 40, 40-latek. Broadcast from 1975 to 1978. The title character, Stefan Karwowski, is an engineer working on, among other things, the Łazienkowska route, which was one of the main routes in Warsaw. So, the creators of the film had no shortage of opportunities to show people working on construction sites. However, each scene played in the field or with workers depicted not so much a collective, but a loose group of workers scattered in all directions. they have to be constantly given orders because they are lazy and dependent. The task they perform has to be inspected because the workers are unorganized and incompetent. All in all, then, the disheveled workers' collective seems almost an unnecessary part of the construction. The key figure of the series is the titular 40-year-old, a character who concentrates typicity of an elevated standard in keeping with the ambitions of modernizing Poland in the 70s. His professional and private affairs, promotion, self-promotion, raising growing children, investing his own savings, health and fitness, middle life crisis, and so on, they refer to the concern of a social group that, having achieved widespread recognition and material stability, cautiously probes the possibility of going beyond the current model of life. On behalf of this group, the protagonist coddles his noble ancestors. He faked it, yes? He bought a painting with his or non-his ancestor presenting a noble man with sword, yes? Whereas Stefan Karwowski is a fruit of peasant family, yeah? That's it. So he faked his roots. He bought a recreational plot of land. He stood away from politics and power, and he started jogging. He tried to reconcile high and low culture, and so on and so on. So these are behaviors of middle class. Karwowski and his relatives are helped in solving their problems by the working woman, a prefiguration of personal advisor and coach from the 1990s. This modestly sized group, exaggeratedly distancing themselves from straight people and awkwardly vying their own distinction, was representative of the forming middle class in People's Republic of Poland. The class didn't play a distinct role in the broader social plan. After all, it was gaining strength through the modernization of the state and through its own ability to absorb the tradition of the nobility and intelligentsia. But the importance of the middle class was also growing because the cultural representation of the other two classes, the working class and the peasantry, were becoming the object of malicious representations. At the time of the class order decomposition, the outline of a new sociological orthodoxy was emerging. Adam Michnik's book, Church Left a Dialogue, which outlined the main actors in the new alliance, was published in 1977. In the book, which was one of the most influential publications of the late 1970s and the 80s, the author analyzed the pre- and post-war relations between Poland's leftist intelligentsia and Catholic Church. The leftist intelligentsia sided with progress, tolerance, and pluralism, while the Catholic Church defended doctrine, unity, and hierarchy. According to Michnik, however, the event of the 1976 exposed the possibility of an alliance. I quote, "The plane of encounter across nations and across denominations is the anti-totalitarianism vision of the unity of human rights and duties." The end of quotation. Thus, the oppressive strategy of the state, which tramples on elementary human values as dear to Christians as to us, it's a quotation, the people of the secular left, has created the premises for an encounter with Christianity. By pointing out the possibility of an alliance, Michnik regrouped the Polish worldview and political scene. Previously, the secular left was seen primarily as anti-clerical, while the author gave it a social democratic and liberal character. The left met the church in the area of human rights, the right to freedom of religion and to live in dignity, the two most serious subjects of Polish social life, Catholics and leftist oppositionists, were able to unite thanks to the recognition of a common adversary, namely the communist state, which violated human rights. As long as the adversary, that is the communist regime, oppressed one and the other, the reconciliation between the left and the church was likely to last. Michnik further clarified this concept in the same year in the article New Evolutionism, one of the most important theoretical manifestos of the Polish democratic opposition of the 1970s. In the text, the author described the abandonment of revisionist thought by the leftist intelligentsia in favor of a democratic and anti-totalitarian stance. As a result of this change, the opposition took on an anti-political character. That is, it defined itself primarily in terms of values, dignity, truth, honesty, rather than political goals. This involved the abandonment of leftist language based on notions of class struggle, social rights, emancipation, or revolution. The change in the opposition's attitude and program involved a change of addressee. It was no longer a matter of writing memoranda to the political party, but a focus on contact with the society. The opposition chose the workers. I quote, "There seems to be no doubt that this is the social group that the power elite fears most and before whose pressure it must give way. The pressure of the workers' circles is a prerequisite for the evolution of collective life towards democratic forms. It is symptomatic that the author, that Michnik, uses the term social group rather than social class in this passage and views the historical process as an evolution, not revolution, evolution toward democracy rather than a drive to overcome oppression or even more to bring about revolution. It can be thought that the term social group served to resolve a contradiction. On the one hand, the increasingly unfavorable cultural images of the working class excluded its leading role. On the other hand, the program of political opposition recognized the workers as the only class capable of exerting pressure on the political party and the government. This contradiction was resolved by the idea of casting the intelligentsia in the role of advisors who would provide the workers with the right words and definitions and thus transform the ignorant people into an active subject of political struggle. The question, however, is what the struggle was supposed to lead to. Before answering this question, let me summarize the current theme. The opposition of the 1970s changed its self-definition, self-organization, and addressee, which led to a meeting between the left and the church, that is, the development of a common language between two previously distant circles. The left stopped working for a real revolution, and Catholics spoke the language of the open church. Thus, the left was losing left-wing orthodoxy, and its representatives thought that Catholics were giving up Catholic orthodoxy. Michnik put this process as follows. The consistently anti-communist stance of the church hierarchy, which rejects all social and political changes made after 1945, is transforming more and more clearly into a consistently anti-totalitarian stance. jeremiads against godless people are giving way to documents referring to the principles of the Declaration of Human Rights. The Polish bishops defend in their pastoral letters the right to truth. They defend freedom and the dignity of the human person. They also defend, which is particularly important in this context, the civil rights of working people, especially, this is still the quotation, especially the right to strike and the right to independent trade unions. Let's note an interesting paradox. Michnik attributes to the church the defense of the right to strike and to independent trade unions, and thus he transfers strictly leftist slogans to the church. This doesn't mean that the church in Poland has become militant Catholicism in 1970s. In Michnik's interpretation, the essence of the change taking place in the church strategy was to appeal to a certain meta-language. In this view, Christian values, historically prior, were absorbed into a code expressing the key aspirations of the European Enlightenment: truth, freedom, dignity, the human person, and the final vocabulary in which Catholic specificity is obliterated in favor of the language of human and civil rights. In this language, the Church defends social rights as a component of civil liberty, not as part of labor rights. Leftists in the 1960s looked at history as a purposive process in which class struggle takes place and in which the economic and social background plays a key role. Leftists in the 70s, they defined themselves as democrats, and they retained the concept of the purposefulness of history, but recognized that the purpose of history is a system that guarantees freedom for individuals, not for the masses. These transformations also required defining civil rights rather than justice or equality as the supreme value. The measure of justice became the relationship between the individual and the state, not the social struggle to improve collective living conditions. The final part, accumulation. The transition of the leftist intelligentsia to democratic positions and the abandonment of Marxian language meant that one of the few theories helpful in defining labor was disappearing from Polish public discourse. This sounded like a judgment confirmed a little later by Leszek Nowakowski, who wrote in the conclusion of his monumental monograph Main Currents of Marxism. It is 1978, a book published in 1978. At the moment, Marxism neither explains the world nor changes it. It is only a reservoir of slogans for organizing various interests, most often having nothing to do with those with which Marxism in its original form identified itself. After a century since the collapse of the First International, the prospects for the emergence of a new international capable of defending the interests of the oppressed people of the whole world are less than ever. The diagnosis of the historian commenting on the actions of the opposition and the conclusion of the philosopher summarizing the history of the inspiration of the labor movement so created a disturbing landscape of the disappearance of labor. It was disappearing not as an experience, but as an intellectual challenge, a political problem, and as an axiological issue, and also as a social value. With the crisis of European Marxist philosophy and the Polish version of revisionism, In the 1970s, labor was losing its function as the basis of social life. In the 1970s, let's gather the considerations so far, there was a multifaceted process. The first aspect of it manifested itself in the stabilization of the intellectual idiom of despair, that is, diagnosis of the decay of society, exposing the importance of the individual corrective act. Symmetrically to it was a change in the depiction and valuation of labor. In films and serials and TV series, physical labor was degraded, while individual construction and managerial work gained immeasurably in importance, creating the necessary conditions for the cultural legitimization of the socialist middle class. The third strand played out in leftist concepts, in which the issue of emancipation of the masses gave way to issue of civil rights and individual freedoms. All these transformations, reinforced by the crisis of the 1976, were united by the tendency to diminish the role of collective values and raise the importance of individualism. A strong confirmation of these trends turned out to be the new labor code, introduced in Poland in 1975, and still in force today in major part, which was the first post-war unification of employment regulations. The first sentence put the labor in the center of common axiology, praca w Polskiej Rzeczpospolitej Ludowej, which means work in the Polish People's Republic, the state of the working people, is a fundamental right, duty, and matter of honor for every citizen. The code was quite progressive. It equalized the rights of so-called blue-collar and white-collar workers, w uprawnieniach pracowników fizycznych i umysłowych. There will be no difference between physical workers and intelligentsia. Yes, it was the first statement this kind in the whole after-war period. At the same time, the code marginalized collective bargaining agreements, giving them the function of auxiliary and supplementary acts of the code. From now on, any problems that required a collective solution concerning, for example, working conditions or the management of workplaces could only be resolved through informal talks, petitions, or collective protests. For Poland, this meant accelerating the process of de-socialization of labor and de-unionization of crews. That is why the strike and protests of the 1980 focused on an independent trade union as the basis for regaining collective influence and values of labor. However, what was halted in 1980 returned with redoubled force after 1989. Then the process proved unstoppable. Indeed, the holistic shift that had the character of cultural legitimacy for the new law, tying labor primarily to the individual rather than to society, defining the employer's obligations to the individual rather than to collective, assessing the political system essentially from the side of narrowly defined civil rights. In the new arrangement, there was less and less room for the social and more for the individual. In this way, I'm trying to explain a cruel historical riddle. How did it come to pass that at the end of the 80s, the massive and pro-social movement of solidarity began to massively support anti-social market solutions, such as layoffs, eliminations of social rights, suspension of the right to strike? This The simplistic answer is that from the 1970s onward, to be a worker meant a shameful identity. And from the 1970s onward, to belong to the working class meant belonging to an inferior people who can only mean something in the masses, not individually. At the beginning of the 21st century, the unsatisfied pride of the lower classes and the unsatisfied demand for care from the state returned as the repressed content of socialism. But, as it happens with repressed content, socialism turned into collective price of authoritarianism. But that is a matter for another history. Thank you very much.